You know that gut drop feeling when you realize someone's been messing with your security. That hit me hard the morning I found out my gate code was posted on a public Facebook group by none other than Judith Zimmerman, our HOA president and full-time menace. I'm Adrian Ellwood. I moved into Oakvale Estates to get peace and a little space from the madness of city life. Instead, I got stuck in a neighborhood dictatorship run by a woman who thinks she's the sheriff of everything from lawn length to mailbox color. It started with some packages going missing. At first, I figured porch pirates were just getting bold. But then my neighbor, Marvin, came by holding his phone like it was radioactive. "Adrian, you might want to see this," he said, eyes wide. He pulled up a Facebook post in the Oakvale Community Watch group. There it was, my gate code, my freaking gate code, posted right there by Judith, captioned, "For deliveries and trusted guests, smiling face with smiling eyes, trusted guests." She gave full access to my private gate like it was a coupon code. I nearly dropped my coffee. She did not. She did. Check the comments too. I scrolled. People were tagging each other, making jokes, even asking if they could use my gate to shortcut the traffic on the main road. I stormed over to the HOA office, which was just a converted room in Judith's oversized colonial, because of course it was. She answered the door in a pastel sweater, her hair in that perfect helmet shape only HOA Karens seem to pull off. "Adrian, lovely day, isn't it?" she chirped, like she hadn't just obliterated the concept of private property. "You posted my gate code." Her smile didn't budge. "Well, yes, for community convenience. You weren't using your side gate often, and the delivery drivers, it's my gate, on my property, you had no right." "Adrian, don't be difficult, we're all neighbors here. The HOA has oversight on shared access points." "It's not shared, it's on my land." "You think just because you're HOA president you can do whatever you want." She chuckled like I was a toddler throwing a tantrum. "You should be thanking me. You might even get better Amazon service now." I left before I said something that would get me arrested, but I wasn't just angry, I was done. So I called in a favor. My brother-in-law works in commercial security systems. By the end of the week, I had contractors installing a full keycard system on the gate. No more codes, no more unauthorized access. Each card was linked to a user, no duplicates, no sharing. And just to make a point, I didn't give Judith one. The next morning, I watched from my porch with my coffee as Judith pulled up in her gold SUV, slowed at the gate, and waited. She tapped the call box. Nothing. She honked. I just waved. She got out and marched up to the fence like she was going to shout it open. "Adrian, this is unacceptable." I walked down my driveway, calm as could be. "Private property, Judith. You set the precedent. You're blocking neighborhood access." "Nope, just reclaiming my own. You abused the code. Now you don't get a card." Her face turned a shade of red I hadn't seen since our last HOA meeting when she tried to fine Marvin for having a garden gnome. "You'll be hearing from the HOA board." "Good. I've got something to say to them too." That was the moment I decided I wasn't just going to stop her, I was going to take the whole rotten operation down. The next HOA board meeting was held in the Oakvale Community Center. A beige stucco building with flickering fluorescent lights and chairs that felt like they were designed to punish you for attending. I arrived 10 minutes early, carrying a manila folder packed with documents and a flash drive. Judith was already there, seated at the head of the table like a queen guarding a throne, flanked by her usual trio of yes-men. Harold, who could never remember which motion was being voted on. Denise, who documented everything except the truth. And Stan, who'd once tried to fine a neighbor for using non-regulation mulch. Judith glanced up as I walked in, her expression as stiff as the collar on her lavender blouse. "Adrian, I didn't expect to see you here so soon after your stunt." "Evening, Judith. I brought some things I think the board should see." She gave a tight-lipped nod, clearly annoyed that I was calm. She preferred it when people lost their cool. It made it easier to paint them as unreasonable. The meeting began with the usual drudgery. Approval of minutes, budget overviews, some nonsense about holiday light policies. Then Judith cleared her throat and sat up straighter. "Before we proceed to new business," she said, "I'd like to address a disturbance to the community caused by a resident's unilateral decision to restrict access to what has historically been a shared entry point." I raised my hand, already standing. "I'd like the minutes to reflect that Judith is mischaracterizing private property as common access." Denise began scribbling, though I had no faith she'd write it accurately. I plugged my flash drive into the room's projector and pulled up a plat map of my lot, complete with county records and surveyor signatures. "This," I said, pointing with a laser pen, "is a county-verified map. The gate in question is entirely on my property line. There is no easement. No shared right-of-way. This gate was installed by the previous owner who maintained full control over it, as shown in the title packet I've also uploaded." Judith waved a hand like she was brushing off a fly. "It's irrelevant. The community has grown to rely on that entrance. Reliance doesn't create legal access," I said flatly. "And since I discovered that my gate code was posted online without my consent, I've legally secured my property. There was no vote, no notification. You exposed my home to trespassers." Denise stopped writing. Harold blinked. "Wait, you're saying the code was posted online, publicly, in a Facebook group that Judith moderates?" Judith's voice sharpened. "I acted in the interest of delivery convenience. Nothing malicious." "That's not how the law works," I said, flipping to a screenshot of the post with her name clearly visible. "You distributed an access code to someone else's property without permission. That's reckless endangerment. You put my home and family at risk." I paused, letting the silence thicken. Then I turned to the back of the room where a man in a plain gray blazer stood. "Detective Monroe, would you like to weigh in?" Judith paled. Monroe stepped forward, nodding to the board. "We've reviewed the complaint filed by Mr. Ellwood. Posting a gate code for a secured entry without the owner's consent, especially on a public platform, can be classified under California Penal Code as unlawful dissemination of security information. If an incident had occurred as a result break-in, vandalism, it could elevate to criminal negligence." Judith stood abruptly. "That's absurd. It was a code, not classified intelligence." "Doesn't matter," Monroe said. "What matters is intent and consequence. We're not charging you yet." "But we are investigating." Judith's gaze darted toward Harold, then Denise, who both seemed frozen by the weight of a potential criminal inquiry. I turned to the board. "I'd like to propose a motion for a formal ethics investigation into the president's conduct and a temporary suspension of her authority until the police investigation concludes." Stan actually coughed. That's serious, Adrian." "Not as serious as a homeowner getting robbed because the HOA president thought she was above the law," Denise spoke quietly. "I second the motion." Judith's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her usual self-assurance had evaporated, replaced with the realization that this wasn't going away quietly. The vote passed, 3-1. Only Harold abstained, more confused than defiant. As the meeting adjourned, Judith stormed out without looking at anyone. I waited until the crowd filtered out, then walked over to Detective Monroe. "She's going to retaliate," I said. "You know that, right?" "Let her try," he said. "Just keep documenting everything and maybe check your tires before you drive." The next 48 hours were quiet, too quiet. Then the letters started arriving. First, one accusing me of violating aesthetic continuity by installing unauthorized access technology. Then another citing a non-existent clause about gate hardware uniformity. Both came with absurd fines over $2,000 combined, and both were signed by Judith, even though she was suspended. I didn't respond. Not directly. Instead, I filed a formal complaint with the City Code Enforcement Office and copied the county clerk, attaching the HOA's bylaws and noting that any fines issued by a suspended officer were invalid. I also forwarded the letters to Monroe. Then I walked over to Marvin's house. She's coming unhinged, I told him. He nodded. I heard she's been calling emergency board meetings in her garage, without quorum? Yup, just her and that guy who tried to ban wind chimes. We began reaching out to other residents quietly, respectfully. People were more than ready to talk. Turns out, Judith had been cooking the books on landscaping fees, overcharging for maintenance, and issuing selective fines to silence people who challenged her. One neighbor, a retired accountant named Nora, had been documenting discrepancies in the annual budget reports for over a year. When we compared her numbers to the HOA's official records, there was a $10,000 shortfall money that had supposedly gone to irrigation repairs that never happened. That's when things turned from petty to criminal. We compiled everything: bank statements, invoices, emails, and testimony, and handed it to Monroe. A week later, an unmarked car pulled up to Judith's house. She was walked out in handcuffs for financial misappropriation and misuse of HOA funds. The neighborhood watched in stunned silence as the Queen of Oakvale Estates was loaded into the back of a cruiser. No one said a word. No one stepped forward to defend her. Later that evening, I got a knock at my door. It was Denise. "We're holding an emergency election," she said. "We want you on the ballot." I stared at her. "I'm not a politician." "You're the only one who stood up to her and didn't fold." I looked past her, toward the once lively street that had been living under quiet tyranny for too long. "All right," I said, "but we're rewriting the bylaws." "From the ground up," Denise smiled. "That's exactly what we were hoping you'd say." 3 weeks after Judith's arrest, the neighborhood felt like it had taken a long exhale. Lawns still needed trimming, kids still rode scooters too fast down the sidewalks, and people still overwatered their hydrangeas, but something had shifted. People waved longer. They talked more, and more importantly, they started asking questions. The emergency election was scheduled for the second Saturday in May. I was listed as a candidate for president, alongside 2 other residents: Nora, the retired accountant, and Calvin, a local contractor known for fixing people's fences without ever charging them. None of us wanted power. We wanted protection from it. I spent the week leading up to the election reviewing the HOA's charter, which was about as coherent as a napkin with notes from a fever dream. It had been patched together over 30 years, with revisions that contradicted each other and clauses that gave the board sweeping powers with no checks. No wonder Judith had run wild. The night before the vote, I was reviewing the latest audit findings in my dining room when someone knocked. It was Calvin, holding a manila envelope and looking like he'd just seen something that didn't belong in a quiet suburb. "You got a second?" he asked. I waved him in and cleared a stack of documents from a chair. He slapped the envelope on the table and sat down. "I was getting quotes for the pothole work on Elmwood," he said. "Thought I'd check out the HOA's contractor records, see what they paid last time. And the company doesn't exist, not in the state registry, not on tax filings, nothing." I opened the envelope. Inside were 3 invoices from a company called Watermark Paving Solutions, all dated 6 months apart, all signed off by Judith, each one for several $1,000s. "Stan signed off too," Calvin added. "His name's on the approval lines." I tapped the invoice. "This address doesn't even have a street number." "There's more." I checked the routing number on the payment stubs. "It's linked to a personal account." "Whose?" He hesitated. "Judith's nephew, lives in Nevada, works at a ski resort, no connection to construction." "This is fraud," I said. "Worse. This is embezzlement across state lines." We made copies of everything and sent them straight to Detective Monroe and the district attorney's office. Within 48 hours, a federal investigator contacted us. Turns out, the phony contractor account had been used to launder over $30,000 from HOA funds over a 2-year period. That moved the case out of local jurisdiction and into federal territory. At the same time, Monroe came by with an update. "They found a second set of books," he told me, standing in my driveway under the street lamp. hidden in a file cabinet behind a false panel in her garage. She was logging cash payments from residents and never depositing them, just pocketing it. I stared at the ground. How much? Too early to say exactly. At least another 20 grand, maybe more. Judith had been running a side hustle out of the HOA treasury, and no one had noticed because she'd kept everyone just annoyed enough to never dig deeper. Election day arrived with an energy I hadn't felt since I moved in. The community center was packed. People brought folding chairs. Someone brought donuts. Kids ran around without being scolded. It felt like a block party disguised as democracy. After the votes were counted, Calvin was elected grounds officer, Nora took over finance, and I was named president. No speeches. No confetti. Just a quiet, collective nod that things were going to be different. Our first meeting was closed to the public. We needed to clean house before opening the doors. I found this in the bylaws, Nora said, flipping to a page in the charter. Technically, the board can appoint a compliance officer with investigative authority during times of transition. I raised an eyebrow. You thinking of someone? Yeah. Won't that look like a power grab? She shook her head. You're the only one who already knows where the bodies are buried. I agreed reluctantly. Our first order of business: freeze all HOA accounts and send notices to all vendors. If they weren't verified, they weren't getting paid. The second: open a formal restitution process for residents who'd been overcharged or fined under false pretenses. That meant combing through every violation issued in the last 5 years. It was exhausting, but it was justice. The third: notify the neighborhood of what we'd found. We drafted a letter, plain and direct. No spin, just facts. Judith had embezzled funds, fabricated vendors, and issued unlawful fines. The board was cooperating with federal investigators, and restitution would follow. The letter ended with a promise: transparency every step of the way. We hand-delivered copies to every house. I expected pushback, maybe even anger. What I got were handshakes, thank yous. One elderly man, who I'd only seen once mowing at midnight, just nodded and said, "About time." A week later, I got a call from the assistant U.S. attorney handling the case. "We're building a strong file," she said. "The financial trail is solid, but we need something else: proof that she used her position to suppress whistleblowers. Anything that shows she targeted residents for asking questions." I remembered Marvin's gnome fine. I remembered how Judith had tried to evict Nora from the finance committee last year after she asked about irrigation costs. And I remembered something else: an old voicemail from a neighbor named Teresa. She'd left a message months ago saying she wanted to talk about something weird with the HOA books. Then she'd gone radio silent. I called Teresa. She answered on the third ring. Her voice was cautious. "Adrian? Yeah, I need to ask you something. It's about Judith." "And the books?" There was a long pause. "She found out I'd been comparing the landscaping invoices," she said. "I got a letter the next week saying my backyard shed violated height regulations. It doesn't. Then she fined me for non-native plants in my yard." I looked it up. Nothing in the bylaws. "Did you keep the letters?" "Of course. I knew something was off. I've got a whole file." I picked it up that night. It was more than I expected: photos, notes, even audio recordings from HOA meetings where Judith changed rules mid-session to justify fines. We handed everything over. 3 weeks later, Judith was indicted on 5 counts: wire fraud, theft of HOA funds, falsifying financial records, abuse of authority, and retaliatory misconduct. Her nephew was named as a co-conspirator. They'd used HOA money to buy a ski condo in Lake Tahoe under a shell company. The news hit the local papers. Then it hit the state news. HOA fraud was always a side column until someone actually got caught. Now it was front page. Residents started coming forward with more stories. A woman had been fined for putting up a Halloween decoration that Judith said was offensive. Another man had been denied architectural approval for a wheelchair ramp until he paid a processing fee in cash. We logged everyone. By midsummer, we'd rewritten the bylaws from scratch. Every board position had term limits. Every financial decision over $500 had to be voted on publicly. And our books were now open, posted online, updated monthly with explanations for every expense. The gate, still locked, still keycard only. But now, every delivery driver had their own registered card, issued through a new community system we built with Calvin's help. No codes, no back doors. At the next community meeting, I stood in front of the crowd and said one thing: no one gets to run this place like it's theirs alone. Not me. Not anyone. People clapped, not polite claps, real ones, the kind that said, "We've been waiting for this." Later, Nora leaned over and said, "You think she's watching this from jail?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to, she was gone, but we weren't, and we weren't going anywhere. The fall brought a crispness to the air and a quiet resolve to the neighborhood. Oakvale Estates looked the same on the outside, the same neat rows of homes, the same rustle of leaves down the sidewalks, but there was something cleaner beneath it now. A buried rot had been pried out and exposed to daylight, and in its place, something better had started to take root. It had been nearly 2 months since Judith's indictment, and the board was still finding remnants of her manipulation tucked into the strangest places. Altered permit requests, duplicated fines with different amounts, even a set of blank violation slips pre-signed with her initials. At this point, we were less shocked than we were exhausted, but we weren't done. One morning, a city inspector named Ruben knocked on my door, holding a clipboard and a small leather-bound notebook. He wore a faded jacket with a patch from the County Building Commission and had the kind of slow, deliberate manner that made you listen closely when he finally spoke. "You're on the HOA board now," he asked. "President," I said, setting down my coffee, though I try not to lead with that. Ruben nodded, then flipped open his notebook. "Need to talk to you about a permit request filed last spring. Has your name on it, but the signatures don't match." I scanned the copy he handed me. It was for a shared-use pedestrian gate installation filed 3 months before I moved in. "That's not mine," I said. "I've never seen this." "Thought so," Ruben said. "We ran the name on the contractor too." "Doesn't exist, but the paperwork was used to authorize a utilities reroute along the western property line. That line runs through your yard." I felt something cold settle in the pit of my stomach. Utilities rerouted, fiber and water. "The records show a variance request was approved, but there's no digital copy, just this form. Looks like the signature was traced." "Why would she?" I paused. Judith wanted to control access. She needed an excuse to make the gate seem like public right-of-way. So she faked a shared-use permit and rerouted infrastructure to make the gate look like a utility easement. Ruben nodded slowly. "That's what we're thinking." "What does that mean legally?" "It means someone forged a permit to manipulate county infrastructure." "That's a felony." I took a breath and leaned against the doorframe. "You think she'd help?" Ruben didn't answer right away. He flipped a few pages in his notebook, then looked up. The approval stamp came from someone in the city zoning office. Name's Dwight Merriman. "We flagged him last year for pushing through high-speed permits on a private development. Fired after a whistleblower came forward." "You're saying this was a pattern?" "Looks like she used her position here to feed requests to him, and he rubber-stamped them. Most were small enough to avoid notice. This one wasn't." "What happens now?" County prosecutors taking it, and since the permit involved utility rerouting, that brings in the state's infrastructure fraud division. I didn't respond. I just nodded and watched him walk back to his truck. That evening, I called an emergency board meeting. Calvin, Nora, and Denise arrived within the hour, each of them carrying files and expressions that had long since traded outrage for focus. I explained what Ruben had told me and passed around copies of the forged permit. Nora stared at the document, her fingers tightening slightly around the edges. "She used your name. She forged your consent. And redirected public access to make it look like I donated the gate for community use," I said. "That's why she didn't think she needed my permission to share the code. She thought she'd rewritten the history." Calvin looked up. We need to notify the residents. Everyone needs to know how deep this went. I'll draft a letter, I said. But there's more. I want a full audit of every infrastructure-related expense going back 5 years. If she forged this, she may have done it elsewhere. We didn't stop there. We submitted a formal complaint to the State Board of Public Works, attaching all the documentation we had. We also contacted a few residents whose property lines were close to the gate. Turns out, 2 of them had received letters from the HOA last year pressuring them to relinquish narrow strips of land for community access. One of those letters had Judith's handwriting on the envelope. The request inside had been typed unsigned. The state investigation unfolded fast. Faster than any of us expected. Within 10 days, the Attorney General's office issued a statement confirming it was examining a network of fraudulent property claims involving a small number of homeowner associations and corrupt officials. Oakvale was named directly. I got a call from Ruben again. "They're issuing warrants," he said. "Not just for her. 2 people in zoning, 1 former HOA treasurer from a different neighborhood, and 1 private surveyor who's already confessing. What about the utility reroute? They're reversing it, and the state's footing the bill. You'll get your yard back, gate included." It was more than I'd hoped for, but it wasn't over yet. A week later, I was asked to testify before a state oversight panel. They wanted details on how the HOA had operated, how Judith had consolidated power, and how the board had managed to reverse the damage. I didn't wear a suit. I wore the same flannel shirt I wore when I installed the Keycard reader on my gate, because this wasn't about politics. It was about telling the truth. I told them everything. The missing money, the falsified violations, the ghost contractors, the manipulated gate permit. I showed them the code screenshot, the forged signature, the audio recording from Teresa's file. When I finished, one of the panel members, a woman with silver hair and a voice that carried, leaned forward. "And what made you challenge her? What pushed you to take action?" I thought about it for a moment. She made the mistake of thinking no one would ever stand up to her. That she could cross every line and we'd keep our heads down, but people here aren't weak. They were just waiting for someone to say enough. The room was quiet for a beat. Then another panelist nodded and said, "Consider this a warning to every HOA in the state." That was the last time I spoke publicly about it. Back in Oakvale, things settled into something closer to normal. The new bylaws went into effect. The books were clean. The board meetings turned from battlegrounds into actual discussions. We added a community garden on the south end of the neighborhood, Nora's idea, and Calvin built the raised beds himself. People volunteered. People smiled. And for the first time in years, no one was afraid of getting a letter for planting tulips too close to the curb. The gate stayed Keycard only. But now, there was a small plaque beside it. Just a simple brushed metal square with 1 sentence engraved on it. "This gate belongs to its owner." And no one else. One afternoon, as I was raking leaves along the driveway, a new neighbor walked up, someone who'd moved in during the chaos and hadn't yet heard the story. "Hey," he said, nodding at the gate. "That yours?" "Yep, looks secure." "It is." He paused, then tilted his head. "Why the keycards? Seems fancy for a side gate." I smiled, not out of smugness, but something quieter earned. "Long story," I said. "But let's just say it keeps the right people in and the wrong ones out." He nodded and kept walking. And I went back to raking. The rustle of leaves beneath my boots just loud enough to drown out the memory of everything we dug up and burned away.